moment to thank our presenting partner, P&G, for helping to make today's event possible.
Hi, everybody. I'm Time Senior Correspondent Charlotte Alter, and I'm so excited to welcome you to Time's first ever Voices of the Future Women's Summit. In the past year, as part of my work here at Time, I've traveled the country to report on the political situation here in the United States. And I've had the privilege of meeting with so many women who are fighting for a fairer, more just American future. And today, in honor of International Women's Day, we will be spotlighting the perspectives and achievements of women who are shaping our world in remarkable ways. We've convened leaders, activists, artists, and more to share their insights on how our world can come together to create a more just, more equal, and more resilient future. Among those joining us today are Alicia Keys, Cate Blanchett, Amanda Gorman, Jane Goodall, Patrisse Cullors, Dolores Huerta, and many more. Together, these remarkable women will be discussing their efforts to create, to innovate, to build impactful movements, and to demand change. It is now my pleasure to welcome our first guests, multiple Grammy Award-winning singer-songwriter Alicia Keys, poet, author, and activist Amanda Gorman, and my colleague, Time Senior Editor Lucy Feldman.
Hi, I'm Lucy Feldman, a senior editor here at Time, and today I have the incredible privilege of speaking with inaugural poet Amanda Gorman and music icon Alicia Keys. Welcome to the show.
Yeah. Hi. We were just
Great to
saying
see everybody.
I know. We were just saying we really wish we could just be in person and having this deep convo, but this is good. This is a blessing because look, we're able to do so many things that maybe we wouldn't have been able to. So that is so good. Mm-hmm. I have a question right away. Look, I'm ready.
Okay.
I was just thinking, we were just talking and, a little bit before we actually started and you happened to say like, this is going to be a super casual conversation and, we want to just talk as we would talk. And I was just thinking how it's highly likely that Amanda, you are now in the room with so many people who you have watched or seen or been inspired by, or have a love for and admiration for, whatever the case might be. And I remember when my music first came out, and I found myself in those same rooms, and I was like, literally felt like I landed on outer space. I was like, what is this? And where am I? And how did I get here? How has that been feeling for you? And, do you also feel like you're on outer space? What do you feel like in these different spaces? Obviously I saw you just had a conversation with Michelle Obama. It's like, what are you feeling like?
Well, thank you so much for that question. And I will add, this is definitely one of those rooms right now talking with you. So I'll give you the, live feedback of what's going through my brain right now. I think you hit it spot on. I mean, it feels like you're in outer space because all of a sudden your life is operating on kind of like a different law of physics. Like all of a sudden things that seemed impossible or unattainable are reality. And so I'm still moving through it, and I have to remind myself that it's real. Often when I go to bed at night, I feel like I'm going to wake up and it's going to be January 19th and I'm about to perform at the inauguration. Just so much has happened post then that feels like an alternate reality. I'm like, if I touch Alicia Keys, will she dissolve? And then the dream will transition to something else. But yeah, so I'm just trying to absorb it as best as I can and move forward. And, looking to people like you who I obviously admire for so long, how have the women that I look up to navigated, upward mobility and visibility in a gracious way?
Oh my gosh. I hear you. I just want you to know I super hear you and I really understand a lot of what you're feeling. And if you ever need a big sister to kind of talk through and just kind of figure it out, I am so here So truly, after this, we'll make sure we exchange stuff. And, I love being a big sister, and I'm a good one.
I'm sure you are. Thank you for that, because I'm a twin. So I never really got the age different sister experience. It was just like, now it's your birthday and it's my birthday. So I love the idea of having a big sister in Alicia Keys.
I mean, this is an amazing offer. Obviously, you have to take her up on it. And I love your question, Alicia. It's such a good one. And kind of building on that, Amanda, so much has been made about your age and the fact that you have achieved this level of recognition at such a young age. And I know, Alicia, it's very similar to what you experienced. I think you were 20 when you released your first album. Right. And right off the bat, you won 5 Grammys and you sort of skyrocketed in a very similar way. I'm curious, Alicia, if you have any advice, which is kind of funny for me to ask secondhand, but how do you think about that time in your life? And if you were to do it again, like, what do you wish that you had known at that time?
Wow, that's such a good question. That's really
I'm
good.
so glad you asked it. That was my question. I'm just going to take some notes really quickly while I listen.
Amazing. I think that looking back, I did feel like I automatically had to be perfect. I felt like I was somehow had to be, this image or this perfection that people expected of me. And I carried that through a lot of my life. And so if there's one thing that I would definitely share, it's like your humanity and your individuality and the fact that you are imperfect. In fact, that's why, I actually have decided to remove the word perfect from my vocabulary because I think it's detrimental. I think it's a detrimental concept. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so being perfectly imperfect is the magic. And now I know that. And so I'm comfortable just kind of like being in my moments. I would find that I would meet people and I felt the need to please them and do everything that would make them feel good. And even if I was off, I was down, I was blue, whatever I was going through, I didn't honor that. I automatically felt like I had to accommodate. And I think that's a very divine feminine attribute, which is a beautiful part of us as women. But also, I think we really have to be aware that we're over accommodating. So that's one thing that I would share, that I would, want you to not feel like you have to do or be, and to just honor how you feel. And just get, even in the practice, which I have a feeling you do because you're a writer, a poet, because you are gifted with words, hopefully you do feel that you can honor exactly where you are, and just relate that. Because I find that I got into the practice of being like, I'm not so good today. I'm kind of like a little off, but I'm working through it. And, I'm gonna be okay. And that helped me, as opposed to feeling like I always have to be, I'm fine, I'm good, it's great. Like, look, it's like, it's a plethora of feelings and we're allowed to feel it. And then the second thing I would just say that I think I took away a lot from is just I don't know, just like everything is, you're in awe of it all. And I know what it is. I would have wanted to be more comfortable asking for guidance. I felt like I had to suddenly know everything and be good at it. And I didn't feel comfortable asking people like, whoa, what was your experience? Or like, man, I'm feeling this. How do I deal with that? And so therefore, I think I missed out on some relationships that really could have helped me not feel so lonely, or not feel so kind of in outer space all by myself. And so that would be another thing. Those are my 2 things that I feel like I would pass off.
Oh, those are gold. I love that. And thank you so much for sharing that with me and your honesty, because it's definitely something in terms of like the perfectionism that I've been feeling, especially when you're so young. And as you mentioned, female, there is this double standard that you hold yourself to of being a pristine kind of untouchable image when in fact we're all human. And I think I'm still learning that perfectionism doesn't serve me and it doesn't serve my craft. In fact, it destroys my creativity and destroys kind of my own personal mission. So learning to lean away from the expectation of perfection, which, as you said, shouldn't even be in our vocabulary, but just leaning into authenticity.
Alicia, this conversation reminds me of something that you were speaking about recently, about how when you were first starting out, you felt like you had to appear as tough as possible. And over time, you've come to be able to embrace vulnerability. And I was just reflecting on that a little bit, because I feel personally in awe of people who are brave enough to live their lives in public, because, you know, you step one foot out and you can be criticized for anything and everything. And that is so scary. And I just wonder, you know, how do you get to a place where you can feel confident being yourself and showing that softer side?
I put on that tough exterior because I grew up in Hell's Kitchen. I was an only child. I was the daughter of, you know, a single mother. I had to walk certain streets that were ugly. And so I had to have a certain energy that I walked with in order to survive that. And then I carried that with me, because in so many ways that was, you know, times 10, the industry that I walked into. You know, so I just kept it. Then I held it and I kept it on my back, and it served me, I felt, because people knew that, you know, I had an idea and I had a certain strength that they couldn't just, you know, I wasn't just a pushover, but I was internally terrified because it was a new world and I didn't know what to do or how to do it. And I was just, you know, my first experience was between 14 and 15. I was signed at 16, and then from there on. So it was definitely, I was growing up throughout this experience. So I think that in some ways it's natural to put on this defense just to protect yourself, because you don't want everyone to just be able to get to you or somehow affect you or whatever it is. And that is true in art. You know, we do put ourselves out there and a lot of people aren't going to like it, you know? And that was so hard for me. I did not know how to deal with that. I didn't know how to feel about that. And as much as I was like, so what? I felt some kind of way if you didn't like what I worked so hard to offer or to give. And, you know, it got to a point where I wouldn't read reviews like for tours or shows. I wouldn't read reviews. I said, until you can get your ass on this stage and do anything that I do, I don't really respect your thoughts because you're not doing. So I finally had to kind of like come to terms in certain ways to understand what validity do we allow so many people to have over our lives and their judgments. Like, what makes them the voice from which I should feel some type of way about. So but it took a long time. It took a minute so I could finally say, okay, I get it. How about you? I think that, you know, a lot of, obviously so much of people's getting to know you has been likely so positive for you. Does that somehow make you feel does that make you feel very supported and kind of lifted up? Or does it make you in any way feel concerned about what next you might create or anything? Right. I hope it's first, but I just wonder.
Well, I'll say in all honesty, I think it's both. I think when you get that type of positive outpouring, which obviously I'm so grateful for, it is really encouraging, but at the same time, it feels very delicate. Especially if you have this little small voice in the back of your head saying, when is the moment in which I'm going to disappoint them? Is this decision I'm going to make going to turn the tide? So it puts you in this position where you don't want to fail or dishonor that type of light that people have shown you. And so I'm starting to, you know, learn everything that you're talking about in terms of how much legitimacy do I give to criticism that might not even exist yet? How am I building a world of fear in my head. And I actually had a question for you about what you were just talking about, because you were discussing, this kind of facade of toughness. And I was wondering if in your experience, it also comes from being a woman of color. Like, I think we do have this defensive mechanism where we, adopt the strong Black woman schema, but then it's also something that we don't just, internalize in ourselves. It's something that people prescribe and place upon us. So even when we do transition from that neighborhood or that background or that family, it's still something that people expect from us. That vulnerability, for some reason, is off the table. And I was wondering, for you, as you've transitioned, through all of these chapters of your life, how do you continue to grow beyond, that label?
Yes, I think that is so absolutely true, for sure. And I'm thinking about how I grew past that label. I think, I think with time, you also just don't give a shit. And that's what I've realized, that I just don't care as much as I used to about certain things. And I think it's just maturity, and I think it's a process that we all have to go through, and there's not a race to get there or not get there. I think the journey is part of like how you build your how you do find your vulnerability, or allowance has been a big thing for me too, like allowing myself to feel how I feel in the moment that I feel it, without trying to fix it, without trying to excuse it, without trying to find the solution for it, to actually just exist in how you feel is a new concept for me. Because I think that in a lot of ways, we're told we're supposed to, get it together, put on put on a strong front, don't let anybody see you down. All these things that are kind of like, they're putting our heads. And next thing we know, we're crafting our life around these concepts that I don't even know where they come from. I mean, they come from like way far, other people's stuff and other people's all types of lies that other people are living with, and that we inherit. So I think that understanding that, learning that, recognizing that, realizing that also gave me the permission to just say, oh, and I also forgive whoever gave me that, because they didn't even know they had it, or their mama gave them that too, whatever the case might be. So I think that the transition has been about being less judgmental about myself and being
and others, it sounds like.
Yes, definitely. But especially myself, because I think we're hardest, of course, we're hardest on ourselves,
It starts like, there, yeah.
Of course. I mean, the inner critic is like something that every artist has to battle, I think. And that's how we set aside, or how we sort of sort out the people who really make an impact. It's the artists who are willing to go there. And this brings me to something else I want to talk about, which is you both released work in the past year, last summer, tied to Black Lives Matter. Alicia, you had your song Perfect Way to Die. Amanda, you had your poem Fury and Faith. Tell me how you see or think about the bridge between art and activism.
Yeah, I'm interested specifically, Amanda, for you, like, has that always been a part of your consciousness? Has that always been what spawned you to write? Do you find that your writing is based in personal reflection that then also tie into what's going on in the world? Has it always been a part of your consciousness, or is that a new thing? I'm interested.
That's a really great question. I'm trying to like break it down into many layers and like summarize it as succinctly as I can. And I think the way I would put it is, I first fell in love with writing for the love of writing. I think when I arrived at that art form, it was for that kind of quintessential ontological pleasure that comes from writing, whether that be about a tree, whether that be about Black Lives Matter. But it was as I continued to grow up and develop a deeper socio-political understanding of activism that I began to realize that this thing that I loved for the sake of loving in itself could be my own weapon, in itself could start a movement. And so I think it was that voyage and that journey of understanding this thing that I feel a calling towards has a power beyond myself. And I think it has to be those kind of two realizations at the same time. I'm always like, I totally encourage people to, become writers, to try writing, to do poems. But I also kind of underscore that if you want to kind of pursue this as a career, it has to be that important to you. It has to feel like breathing. It has to matter more than the press or the fame or the publication, which might not even come. There has to be a calling towards that craft really deep inside of you. And so I think for me, it was discovering this thing that I'm addicted to actually can be marshaled for something that speaks beyond the craft in itself.
That's so
But that happened very early on. I think because I grew up in a very kind of politically minded, vocal household. And so those conversations were always happening. It was more so like uniting two dimensions of myself that already existed rather than creating suddenly a new political identity.
Absolutely. That makes perfect sense. I could see that. I could see that completely. And even the love of words, has that always been something that's been given to you? Do you remember being introduced to reading and words and just even poetry very young? How did you fall in love with words?
I was, ever since I think I could pick up a pen, I was pretty much writing. But I do remember distinctly, I had already been writing for a little bit, but around like 7 years old, my teacher was reading a book called Dandelion Wine to me, which I actually have on this bookshelf by Ray Bradbury. And there was some part in it that, I'm forgetting now, but it was like some metaphor about like candy. And I remember sitting there in my third grade classroom and like my brain exploded. It was just, to me, I was like, I can't imagine anything that would be more magical than what just happened. I can't imagine anything more addictive than what I just experienced. And it was just underscoring for me that this thing that I've been doing in private, this thing that I've been, playing with in this intimate way is actually the thing I want to do for the rest of my life. And so I'm pretty lucky that I kind of came across my calling pretty young. I was 7. I was like, I'm set. I know what I'm doing.
Amazing. That's so cool.
My poor mother, though, was like, how do I stop my child from becoming like, in her head, the poor, starving artist? Because I was like, I want to be a poet. And she was like, what are we going to do so that you can pay your bills? And now it's great because I'm like, we're doing the thing. Here we are. I'm paying my bills. So it's been great.
So good. So good. Yeah. And I think, for me, it actually was interesting because when you asked about Perfect Way to Die, I actually I wasn't ever very good at writing songs that related to issues that were happening currently. I remember the first time one of my first organizations that I was a part of and founded is called Keep a Child Alive. And the first time that I visited it in Africa was stunning and unbelievable. And I met so many people who had such really rich, powerful, incredible stories from the whole spectrum. And I just knew I was going to come back and write like everything that I could have possibly written and took in, and I couldn't, no matter how I tried. I tried and I had different things that was pouring out, but when I looked at it, I was like, it's okay, but it's not doing what I really want it to do. So I kind of put it to the side and I was like, I don't know, maybe it's okay, whatever. And, but I really wanted to. And people would ask me all the time, are you going to write that? What's going on? Are you going to write that, your version of that? And I was like, I hope to, I want to. And so I kind of find that more recently have I started to understand how to bring that forth, and also to collaborate with some really brilliant minds that allow that fruition to find its way in a really understandable way, which I think has been so beautiful. And so with Perfect Way to Die, I actually thought that it was going to be on the next project that I'm currently working on now. I pretty much knew it belonged there. And when everything started happening and our world started changing, and I started to just listen to the music, and I started to allow it to lead me, and just be like, where do you want me to go? And it was the first time that I did that. Every other time I kind of said, here's where I want to go, and here's what I want to do, and what I'm hoping to create. But this time I just was like, well, where do you want me to go? And that was how it started to open up these opportunities for Underdog to be such a clearly kind of understandable perspective of breaking through ceilings, and Good Job, which I actually wrote about my mother. And because, so many women that I know and people that I know every day, they just get up and do what they have to do, and they never get the recognition to know how much that means to so many people in their lives. And I wanted her to know that. And I wanted my best friend to know that, who's a single mother raising her daughter. And I wanted some people to know that. And then boom, all of a sudden, every single essential worker in the world actually needed to know that. And I had the words to do it. And I'm still in awe of it, actually, because it's all magic to me. And it's all incredible that it's even possible to, that happens. I mean, to put pen to paper and to create something that didn't exist is like, it's the ultimate alchemy. It's the ultimate turning metal to gold. It's the ultimate thing. So I don't know. I just find that more recently, it's been something that just has been leading me, and that I've been more ready for, I think, than before. Yeah.
I totally agree with that, because I don't think people realize how hard it is to write, art for a moment. And I often describe it as like trying to follow a butterfly down like a path. If you chase down it too ferociously, if you grasp at it with your hands, it's just kind of drift away from you. But if you do exactly what you just said and listen and be open to kind of the journey, that's when you get to see kind of some progress and momentum. But it's hard striking that balance, because I feel like whenever something happens kind of in the Black experience of America, people look at the Black artists and they say, so what are you making? So what are you doing? What do you have in the kitchen? And it's like, I do want to speak to this moment, but also the art, I actually have very little control over when it comes and when it does not. And, when it is ready to be birthed and born. And it's not always going to be at the specific date that you expect it to.
Well, we all are incredibly lucky to have both of you creating art at whatever pace feels right to you. And I just want to thank you both for being here. And it's been such an honor and a pleasure, honestly, to get to sort of introduce you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Good to see
Love you, Alicia. Love you, Lucy.
Love you guys. Talk to you later.
Thank you so much, Amanda and Alicia, for that powerful conversation. Today, we'll be spotlighting a number of voices of the future, emerging leaders who are already making an impact in their fields. Now, I'm honored to introduce our next special guest, world-renowned conservation advocate Jane Goodall, in conversation with Time senior editor Haley Sweetland Edwards. But first, we have a special message from a young voice in science, young scientist and 2020 Time Kid of the Year, Gitanjali Rao, who has a message for young women who are interested in going into STEM.
Hello everyone, my name is Gitanjali Rao. I'm 15 years old and I'm a sophomore in high school, and I am an innovator, author, and promoter of STEM. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to say a huge happy International Women's Day to everyone watching out there. So, getting involved in science and technology, especially for girls, can seem like a hard task. But as long as you have that inner drive and motivation, then you're able to solve the world's problems. So go out there and solve problems that you see in society and make a positive change in the world, because there is nobody stopping you but yourself. Our generation is growing up in this place where we're seeing problems that have never existed before. And now innovation is not an option, it's a necessity. And each and every one of us have to do our part. So we need all of you watching out there who are even thinking about solving a problem. Go do it, because you have the power to change the world. It was great meeting all of you. Bye.
Hi, I'm Haley Sweetland Edwards, an editor at Time, and I'm joined by Dr. Jane Goodall, the founder of the Jane Goodall Institute. It's an absolute joy to have you here, Jane. Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Let's start with that video from Gitanjali Rao. You and Gitanjali are really on the same page. You travel around the world, both physically and virtually, to share a similar message of grit, determination, and optimism. What is it you hope to convey to the young people around the world?
Well, it depends on the young person. It depends on the country they're in. It depends on the problems that are facing them. So the priority is going to be different. It's not just one suits all, except to remind all of them that every single day they live on this planet, they make some kind of difference, and they can choose what kind of difference, you know. Tell their parents what to buy. I'm not going to eat meat. I'm not going to eat products with palm oil in them. I'm not going to eat cheap products because they were probably made by child slave labor, that kind of thing.
So I remember you saying at some point, I think on a Time video, you know, whether it's cleaning up a schoolyard or volunteering at a local animal shelter, or it's really about what ignites the passion in each person.
Yes, I think that's why our Jane Goodall Institute Roots and Shoots program is growing so fast and so rapidly around the world, because we don't dictate what the young people do. It's do a project. It's done organized in groups. So get together with your group and choose 3 projects, one to help animals, one to help people, one to help the environment, and then work out what you can do and roll up your sleeves and get out there and take action. And so the young people are always working on something they are passionate about and sharing what they're doing. And it's now kindergarten, university, everything in between, and even some adult groups now. So it's changing lives. They write and tell me.
Wow. What are some of your kindergartners doing?
Oh, they love doing organic gardens. They especially love, and even the preschoolers, they love vermiculture. You know, in the days when I could travel before the pandemic, I used to go and look at the vegetable garden, and a kid would open up this lid and take out a handful of nasty bits of school food with little pink worms and dump it in my hand. I have to go, oh, they're lovely, beautiful worms. They're helping the garden.
What about the college age?
College age, well, you think of the different problems in the world, you'll find a group of college kids tackling that problem, whether it's plastic, palm oil, especially these days we're trying to do something about the trafficking of wildlife, because that is one of the main reasons for the initiation of this pandemic. It's our total disrespect of animals and the natural world.
One of the take-homes from this last year has been that these large global crises have different effects in different communities and on different types of people. Certainly on women, certainly on marginalized communities, and depending on what country you're in. How does that sort of recognition inform your work?
Well, I think it's pointed out very clearly the difference between the haves and the have-nots. And so often in so many countries, the have-nots are underserved. They can't get the vaccines and things like that. But, the real takeaway from this past year, this terrible pandemic that's caused so much suffering, is that we simply must develop a new relationship with animals and the natural world. Because as we destroy environments, we crowd animals closer to each other. That's one way a new disease can start. We crowd some animals closer to people. And again, a bacteria or a virus spilling over from one animal to one person can create a new disease. The COVID-19 is thought to have originated from a wildlife market in China. And unfortunately for us, it was very infectious, very contagious, and it's led to suffering all over the world. And as you say, in some of the poorer communities, it's hit the worst. And that's including in countries like the United States and the UK.
It's almost like how do you address something that requires so much global cooperation? How do we even begin? Has this last year been enough to sort of galvanize us to cooperate?
I would hope that enough people have woken up to the fact that we need change. Certainly some governments have understood, and not only change in our relationship to the natural world, of which we are part and upon which we depend. So we go on destroying the natural world. We pay the price. We're paying the price now because we didn't heed the people studying these zoonotic diseases. We just carried on with business as usual. And I hope we've realized that the natural resources of this planet are finite. And we can't go on the assumption that there can be unlimited economic development on a planet with finite resources. And so I hope this past year has helped us understand, we've got to make this new relationship and a new, greener and more sustainable economy. And, there's one other thing which I really want people to zoom in on, that we talk about wildlife markets, we talk about loss of biodiversity, we talk about the sixth great extinction, and we talk about species. But in these wildlife markets where animals are crowded together in horribly cruel conditions, and in our factory farms, the intensive animal agriculture, these animals are individuals. They have their own personality. They have their own life. They can experience fear, terror, pain. And so we need to think what we're doing and think about it from a different perspective. It's not just a species.
You've spoken a lot about this need for, or rather this disconnect between the human mind and the human heart, a need to sort of rekindle this love and compassion for animals and for each other. What does that look like for us?
Well, what it looks like is being less selfish, understanding animals for who they are, and each one of us doing our part. And people feel helpless because, as you just mentioned, the problems are huge. And that's why, in order to ground yourself, and so many people have lost hope, it's no good thinking globally, like you're suggesting. Of course, we have to act globally. But first of all, make sure that you act locally and see that you make a difference. Then know that all around the world, there are people making a difference, just like you and your group. And then you dare to think globally. And everywhere, young people are rising. They literally are all over. They're rising to these new challenges and beginning to take action, not just marching and demanding, but actually leading, showing by example, working very, very hard. And some young people are working really, really hard. to make a difference. And so the question really is, how do we get to some of the despotic political rulers where the public really can't make any impact as we can if we're fortunate enough to be in a democracy?
When you talk about these young people who are working so hard to make a difference, is there someone or a project that comes to mind?
Oh gosh, there's so many projects. We're taking part in the Trillion Tree Challenge. Our Roots and Shoots kids are not only planting the trees, anybody can plant a tree. The main thing is to plant the right tree in the right soil at the right time of year and look after it, make sure that it's growing. So we're trying to protect rainforests, which is the most important thing of all, because they're these old growth forests, they have the rich biodiversity, and we depend for our existence on healthy ecosystems, which depend on the diversity of species that make them up. Protect the rainforests, and that's not easy. In some countries like Brazil, it's jolly difficult, but we've got to restore rainforests, areas which have been deforested. But it's also important to plant trees in urban areas. And you know what's fascinating but horrifying? If you go through a big city, say in the US or the UK, you go through where the affluent people live. There's tree-lined streets and you can see birds up there and you can look at a sunset. Then come to a poorer area, suddenly it's all concrete and gray. And you know, when you green an area where there's high crime, the crime level drops, mental illness drops, people are healthier. We actually need this green world that we're destroying so fast. Greening an urban area also is helping to reduce the heating up of the planet. It becomes cooler. The roots of the trees stabilize the soil, the leaves help to clean the air. So that is something that many, many of our groups are doing and working extremely hard when they do it.
I want to pivot quickly to International Women's Day. In an op-ed for Time a few years ago, you wrote about the need to empower sort of traditionally female characteristics that you had observed among chimpanzees and just generally in the wild. And I was wondering if acting more like women traditionally to get ahead, what does that look like, and how do you speak about that to your female students, particularly
Well, I usually start off by talking about one of the South American tribes, and I don't remember even which country it was in, but it was one of the chiefs. And he said to me, Jane, we see our tribe as like an eagle, and one wing is male and the other wing is female, and only when the two wings are equal can our tribe fly high. So I think, you know, since I began, the inclusion of women in more and more different aspects of society, in science, everywhere, has increased. There's still a lot of discrimination, there's no question about that, in some countries more than others. But one sad trend that I observed, certainly here in the UK, was that in politics, the women and business, the women who tended to be successful were the ones who showed so many male characteristics. And this is sad because we need this balance. We need the attributes that do characterize females. The reason that we have those attributes is because during evolution, the role of the female was to be a good mother. And you can't be a good mother if you're impatient. You need to be able to understand and empathize with others to be a good mother. And so, you know, that's kind of somehow built into our genes. And males tend to get too aggressive. So we need a balance. We need both sides. And of course, every woman has male in her, every male has woman in him. And we've just got to get it right.
Empathy and patience, and another word that you use sometimes is humility. And I think you used it on this call, this need to stop thinking that we can dominate and destroy nature and still be okay. How do you convey that message? And what's something that, again, on sort of a local or a personal level, how do we take that home and internalize that?
Well, I think I don't really know, because I tend to work by interacting with individuals, and individuals react very differently. But, one important way of getting change is not to be confrontational, but to try and reach the heart. That to me is absolutely key in creating change. And I do that with stories. And I've lived long enough to have stories that match almost everything, and try to find out also a little bit about the person that you're going to be meeting with. What is anything you have in common? Love of dogs, or love of nature, or something, so that you just have that tiny little bit that you can cling on to. And then my mother taught me, listen. So you listen to them, because she said, maybe they've got ideas that you never thought of. Maybe it'll help you. Maybe you'll change a bit. Maybe you'll both change a bit. Maybe it'll be a compromise.
That is an inspirational and perfect way to end this conversation. Should all take a little less credit, be a little bit more humble, and listen more.
And remember that every day you live, you make a difference, and you can choose what sort of difference you make. And so we have to alleviate poverty, because if you're really poor, you can't have the luxury of making those decisions, those ethical decisions about what you buy. So sorry, but I have to say that, because alleviating poverty is tremendously important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Dr. Jane Goodall, thank you so much. An absolute pleasure speaking with you. And thank you for all the good work you do.
Well, thank you. And lovely speaking to you. And I hope we manage to do it again.
Me too.
Bye.
Bye.
Jane and Haley, thank you so much for being on the program today. A year ago, for International Women's Day, Time launched the Women of the Year project, in which we told the stories and recognized the impact of influential women from history. Here now to make an exciting announcement about where that project is taking us next, please welcome award-winning filmmaker Alma Harel.
I'm Alma Harel, and 1 year ago, I had the incredible experience of partnering with Time and P&G to celebrate 100 years of women leaders, innovators, activists, entertainers, athletes, and artists who defined the century from 1920 to 2019. Today, we're proud to announce that we're developing this historic mission into a scripted television series with Amazon Studios, giving them much-deserved recognition to defiant women from our past, whose actions are still shaping our world today. As a woman filmmaker working in a still far too male-dominated industry, this project is very personal to me. And continuing with the original vision of Woman of the Year, we will shine a spotlight on and hopefully immortalize a century of visionary, brave women that were often overlooked, and I would even say forgotten. I hope that these women, and now this new series, will make you proud of Human Her Story, and also call on you to make your own.
When you walk through a storm, hold your head up high, and don't be afraid of the dark.
We hope you are enjoying Time's Voices of the Future Women's Summit. We'd like to thank our supporting partner, Jane Walker by Johnny Walker, for helping to make it possible. Please drink responsibly.
Hi, everybody. I'm Time Senior Correspondent Charlotte Alter, and welcome back to Time's first ever Voices of the Future Women's Summit. Still ahead are Cate Blanchett, Raquel Willis, and an inspiring musical performance from Milk. But right now, I'm very glad to be joined by author and Black Lives Matter movement co-founder Patrisse Cullors and Dolores Huerta, the president of the Dolores Huerta Foundation and a famed labor activist. Patrisse and Dolores, I'm so thrilled to have you here. This is such a dream conversation to welcome you both.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Obviously, this has been a period over the last 5 years, really, of tremendous social and political change, and both of you have been at the forefront of that. Dolores, I want to start with you. How do the social movements that have arisen during the Trump era compare to the movement building of the 1960s, which you were obviously very involved in? What's easier and also what's harder?
Well, I think the one thing that we've seen is that it's very integrated. We've seen the marches for Black Lives Matter have a great diversity in them. Of course, there's always been the young people, because the young people are always they push everything forward, but also the fact that it's been so diverse. And I think that's one of the things. The other thing, it was so spontaneous, and that it capitulated not only here in the United States, but all over the world, where we saw these incredible marches. The same thing, we can say the same thing about the movement against gun violence that was started again by the young people in Parkland and Florida. And I think the one thing that has made this mobilization much easier is the fact that we have cell phones, and that people can be mobilized so quickly. People can be informed. And so everything can happen like within minutes, you might say, that people can gather and protest or march and picket, whatever it is. And so I think that in today's world, that really gives us a lot of hope, because that means that we can challenge some of these issues that we have to reform, and we can do it very quickly and do it all together.
Patrisse, can you tell me a little bit about how this diversity and intersectionality was sort of built into the Black Lives Matter movement from the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, you look at Black Lives Matter and you recognize that there are 3 Black women who really started it. And we all are at the intersections of queerness and being raised working class, and also Opal Tometi being a daughter of Nigerian immigrants. And our lived experience really helped shape a different kind of conversation in building out Black Lives Matter. From the very first article that Alicia Garza wrote, the Her Story of BLM, really setting the tone for an intersectional movement, a movement that really fights for all Black lives, a movement that looks at gender justice, a movement that looks at economic justice, a movement that looks at not just the death of Black people, but how Black people will thrive, and what is needed for Black communities to thrive. And so intersectionality was always a center point for our movement, and it was always the foundation for how we've grown.
Do you think it matters that at least in the last several years, so many of these movements have been led by women? How do you think that changes the way these movements have grown, and also the way they've interacted with one another?
Well, I think that is what is so amazing, that women are in the leaderships and the instigators and the organizers of so many of these movements that we see today. And women have always participated, but I think now they are now being recognized as being the leaders, and because often women did all of the work, and then somehow they were just kind of put to one side. Even the Great March on Washington that we know, when Dr. King made his one beautiful speech, there were a lot of women that were there, but they were not recognized. And so I think this is what's different. And I think we have to thank the women's movement for doing this. And I think it also started with the Women's March, because that was one of the great big, you might say, mass celebrations where women again got together all over the world. Not just here in the United States, but all over the world. And I think that it set a standard that women have to be recognized, because, women, we've always done the work, but oftentimes we're just not the ones that get to be the spokespersons or the so-called recognized as the leaders of what we're doing.
Patrice, what do you think about that? How do you think it has helped the movement to have this be a movement that's not just led by one woman, but led by really many women and men as well? You know, how do you think it has strengthened or helped the movement to have women be in such key roles?
I think, as Dolores said to us, you know, women were always in key roles. They just didn't get the visibility. And women have been the architects of social movements for a very long time. And we have lifted up, because of patriarchy, because of sexism, we've lifted up men and the work that men do. And the work that women have done have largely been work that has been invisible labor. And so I think the way in which we've been able to reclaim women and the role that they play, especially women of color, is through social media. Social media has democratized our voices. And so we haven't needed mainstream media to tell our story. And what you've seen from that is a really powerful surge of Black women, and Latinx women, undocumented women, Arab women, Muslim women, across race, but also trans women who have shown up, and their voices have been forced at the forefront. And that has been really powerful and I think really necessary. And I think it's been hard too, because it means with great visibility comes great responsibility. And also it means that you are going to be a target, often of violence. And there's so many studies that have shown that women are often more targeted when they're more visible, and it's often violently. And so it comes with great sacrifice, women in our visibility, but I think it's really worth it to push a new generation forward.
So Patrice, I just want to follow up on, talking about the Black Lives Matter movement. Obviously, prison abolition has been a major topic of conversation in the years since George Floyd's murder. Can you tell me a little bit about your vision for what prison abolition looks like in practice?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to just do a quick shout out to Miriam Kaba, who just launched her book almost a week ago, We Do This Till We Free Us. And it's a book on abolition and transformative justice and organizing. And it's now on the bestsellers list. And so, I think about our elders. I think about our ancestors who are abolitionists in particular, Harriet Tubman specifically, and the work that she did, not just to free enslaved Africans, but also the work she did to communicate around the vision for abolition, and communicating that to the North, to get the North on board, to challenge the ways in which slavery was impacting Black communities and also impacting everybody. And so this conversation around modern day prison abolition is really a conversation for us to interrogate why prisons and police exist in the first place, and to have a new conversation about what does public safety actually look like? Is public safety reliant on a badge and a gun? Or is public safety reliant on people's ability to have access to healthy food, have access to jobs, have access to employment, have access to adequate education? And so that is the conversation about prison abolition. It's not just about getting rid of something, it's about imagining something new.
Wonderful. So on this note, I want to ask both of you about sort of how these grassroots movements are shaping the electoral political system. So Dolores, to what extent do you think movement leaders need to be thinking about the electoral process as they build their coalitions and shape their demands?
Well, we know that this is the end of the road. This is what we all have to organize towards, to make sure that people vote, because marching and protesting and all that is extremely necessary to inform people, to communicate our message, to actually get people to become activated. But if we don't end up voting, then it's all for naught. because the people that we elect are the ones that are going to decide to make the laws. And just we're talking about the whole prison, stopping the school to prison pipeline. And we know that so many of the laws out there that have been made are the ones that are affecting people of color. And I want to say, and poor white folk too, low income people, because these are the people that are incarcerated, and they have made the prison industry a for-profit industry. And this is, when you think how much of every budget of every community goes into policing and how much money is spent. And I like to quote Jesse Jackson, who used to say, it takes more money to keep somebody in jail than it does to send them to Yale. And this is, of course, connected to our educational system also. So that is one thing that we really have to think about where our tax dollars are going. And are they going towards education, towards social work, or are they going to keep people in prisons?
Yeah, I mean, I think electoral justice is one part of the larger strategy to get us towards social change. What we've seen, I think, especially during the election of Donald Trump, was a resurgence of communities, especially women, saying, actually, if this guy can go and get a job in the White House, I can too. I can run for office. And so we've seen the powerful women, the squad, Rep. Cori Bush, who just came from St. Louis, who is now representing in Congress. And that's really powerful. It's really necessary. It also gives us a new vision around when we say go vote. In the past, so much of what we asked people to vote for were things that didn't really match our belief systems. But now we have people who are running for office. We have laws that are progressive, laws that we can vote for, and it's because of movements. You don't win progressive policy necessarily because of of people in elected office. You win progressive policy when movements shape progressive policy and progressive candidates. And it's our job as a movement to hold those people accountable and to implement those progressive policies. As we've seen, Dolores, I want to be like you when I grew up, the Dolores, you've been on the front lines forever, and you've kept showing up, and you probably have a million stories to tell us about all the amazing victories you've won and all the mistakes you've made. And I think that's what makes this work powerful. It's made up of human beings who have decided to keep their bodies on the line and keep showing up. And oftentimes those human beings are women.
So,
well, thank you for
on that note,
you're welcome.
On that, sorry I didn't mean to cut you off there. On that note, how do you think Joe Biden is doing so far? Do you feel that Joe Biden is, President Biden is being accountable to movement in the first couple months of his presidency? Dolores, let's start with you.
I think we see that President Biden is moving right ahead and taking care of the most important issue that we have, the pandemic right now. But it's also with his executive actions, which are quite bold. Talking about immigration reform, just rescinding so many of the executive actions that President Trump did, and I'm very, very proud of him. But the other thing too, going back to your previous question about electoral politics, I mean, we know that so many of the laws that we need to pass, like the voter protection laws, the immigration reform, the climate change issues, these are not going to, even as much as Joe Biden may want these laws to be passed, if we don't have the majority in the House and the Senate, and especially the Senate right now, none of these laws are going to be passed because he can't do it by himself. And so that really goes back to your previous question about the importance of voting. And but I'm hopeful, and we know that just I guess yesterday, Javier Becerra was not confirmed to be the head of the the Human Services Department, Health and Human Services, by one vote, by just one vote in the Senate. So hopefully they'll come back and confirm him. But this is why it's so important that we do the voting and then we do the advocacy and then that we hold our representatives accountable. You know, Michael Moore, I saw him on Broadway, and he said, we wake up in the morning, we do three things. We wash our face, we brush our teeth, and then we call our congressman. So the advocacy is extremely important. It's just as important as voting.
Patrice, what do you think about President Biden's sort of accountability to movement so far?
I think that it's been a challenge. I think, as Dolores said, he came out very strong when it came to many of the executive orders, specifically around the pandemic. But there's still a conversation he's unwilling to have around police budgets, around holding the police accountable. Even with the Justice for Policing Act, that act actually gives more money into law enforcement. That act doesn't stop the flow of money into law enforcement. And what you heard last summer was a demand for reinvestment into our communities, was a demand to defund the police. And the fact that that's a non-starter for President Biden really impacts our relationship to the White House and our ability to move the policies we want to move forward. With that, our movement is grateful that we got a fascist out of office, and grateful that we can work with an administration that is interested in human lives. And so it's a process. I won't give up on the administration, but I will continue to take them to task on police accountability in particular, and also economic justice for Black people.
So obviously, you know, we're hopefully, fingers crossed, close to turning a corner on the pandemic. But this has been a devastating year, in particular for the Black and immigrant and marginalized communities that were disproportionately affected by COVID-19. What do you think we can learn from this crisis about how to better address these inequities, and including those faced by women and women of color specifically? Maybe Patrice, let's start with you.
Well, I think what we've witnessed and what we continue to witness with the global pandemic is a lack of infrastructure in our communities, both at the local level, at the state level, and the national level. We don't have infrastructure to fully care for human beings. We've spent the last 30, 40 years relying on and investing all of our dollars in mostly incarceration. And we've spent very little of our dollars investing in healthcare, mental health care. And we are seeing the grave effects of that. Yes, everybody should be washing their hands, wearing a mask, and not being in big gatherings. And we should also have a system in place in one of the wealthiest countries in the world where people are able to get better when they get sick. There's no reason why 500,000 people should have died because of COVID-19. And so I have to give a scathing critique to the US government right now, because many of us have been yelling for reforms around reducing prison spending, reducing police spending, and putting those dollars back into communities. And we haven't seen that. And now we're seeing the lack of infrastructure totally be exposed right now. And I think that's really sad. And I think we have a long ways to go.
Dolores, what do you think is the takeaway from the pandemic?
Well, it definitely spotlighted the lack of resources that go into communities of color. When the communities of color are the ones that have been the most affected, and more people have died, and even our indigenous communities, you know, which were, I mean, just the statistics are just atrocious. And you know, when we think that we are the richest country in the world and we have these health disparities, there is no reason why we should not have universal health care for everyone, because they do have this in countries in Europe, in countries in Latin America, even little teeny Cuba that has an economic boycott has health care for every one of their citizens, and also education. And I think that is another thing that we really have to talk about. And it's kind of sad when we think of all of the citizens in the United States that have this huge college debt. I mean, that is unbelievable. And we should have free college education for every single person in the United States. And then when we talk about education, We've got to have an education that addresses the issues that we've been talking about today, so that in every single school, starting from kindergarten, children should start learning the real history of the United States, the Howard Zinn history of the United States, the fact that it was the indigenous people that were the first slaves, that the African slaves built the White House and the Congress, and it has been people of color that have been building the structure, the infrastructure of the United States of America that now needs, of course, so much attention. But we've got to we've got to end the racism, the whole idea of white supremacy. That's got to be eliminated, because we cannot afford to grow any more neo-Nazis, fascists, or white supremacists, because this is a threat to our society. And children of color are being deprived every single day because they are not have not been given an equitable education. And then we have the disparities in income. Again, there is no reason for this. I like to quote Rachel Maddow, who said, if we can pinpoint a place in Mars where we can actually send a rocket or this little machine that they send, or with a little helicopter, then how can we excuse the health disparities, the education disparities, the income disparities in our own country? I mean, we should be ashamed in our United States of America that we have so much poverty, and and so much discrimination. And this is not rocket science, you might say, but these are things that we can address, and these are things that we can correct.
Wow, well, I so appreciate both of you joining us today. Thank you so much to Dolores and Patrice for joining us here at the Time Voices of the Future Women's Summit. It's really been an honor. Thank you.
Yes, and we have to work for the Equal Rights Amendment for women, okay? It's going to be coming up in the Senate. Si se puede, we can do it.
This is not new. This has happened before.
In every downturn
and disaster in history, gender equality has been set back
as women have stepped forward.
Women always bear a heavy cost.
More of the frontline care.
More of the pay cuts.
More of the jobs lost.
More of the responsibilities at home.
Keeping them from going back to paid work.
These times are not unprecedented.
But they give us another chance for equality.
If we all choose to step forward as equals.
Care equal.
Hire equal.
Pay equal.
Model equal.
Do equal.
Choose equal.
At home.
At work.
Right now.
For an equal future.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Time's celebration of International Women's Day here at our first ever Voices of the Future Summit. Joining us next are actor and producer Cate Blanchett and producer Stacey Scher in conversation moderated by Time's Reza Bruner.
Hi, I'm Time staff writer Reza Bruner, and I'm joined today by actor, producer, and humanitarian Cate Blanchett and producer Stacey Scher. Thank you so much both for being here today. So Stacey and Cate, you worked together on the Hulu miniseries Mrs. America, which came out last spring. The show brings to life the very fraught politics of the 1970s and some of its most vocal activists. And Cate, you played Phyllis Schlafly, who is a very complicated figure who successfully combated the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. What did you learn from sharing that story, and how has that impacted you today?
Just how terrifying and polarizing any sort of civil discussion around the notion of equality is in America. And I'm, much to my shame, when Stacey and I first started speaking about the project, I was not aware that the American Constitution didn't accept the notion that one couldn't discriminate on the basis of sex, of gender. So the whole process of making Mrs. America was a learning curve. But I think where I wanted to lean in was that women are not a monolith, And I think that's something that the series really deals with. And so that means dealing with second wave feminism and the process of wanting to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, and including as many voices as possible. And that includes Phyllis Schlafly. So it was a process for me of having to set my own worldview and politics aside. I'm for not for black and white examination of anything. I'm for nuance, which I think is the polar opposite of where Phyllis, how she looks at the world. So it was quite difficult, but I think I found it hugely educative.
And Stacey, you have an incredible resume as a producer. You worked on all kinds of projects from Pulp Fiction to Erin Brockovich, Reno 911, and then this. Why did you want to add Mrs. America to that list? What was so important and compelling to you about this story?
Kate always likes to say that because she grew up in Australia, she always identified as a feminist. I grew up in a kind of backlashy America where it became the F word, and I became a feminist really and comfortable with saying that in the 90s. And I was interested in looking at the backlash to the women's movement. And at the time we began, it was really in the lead up to the 2016 election. And when Donald Trump was elected, the story really became the story of how we got here from there. So I mean, that's really has been my enduring interest in it. And if you don't understand Phyllis Schlafly, you don't understand how we have Amy Coney Barrett, you know?
It's interesting because the show came out almost a whole year ago, and in some ways it feels like everything has changed since then, but also in some ways nothing has changed. So what do you think the legacy of this show has been over the past year? What have you taken away from the experience and the conversation that it sparked? Kate?
Well, I think what has been revealed by the pandemic, if we didn't already know it, is that we're all, and it's not just America, it's globally, we're dealing with systemic inequality. And it's not just gender inequality, it's economic inequality, societal inequalities, cultural inequality. And all roads lead to Rome in terms of, I mean, if your constitution doesn't ratify the notion of equality, how can anything that precedes approach equal? And I on a daily basis, I found this, you know, from people that have seen the series and perhaps come late to it. It's just every day, and this is our experience on set as well, is that we think that certain things may have been committed in sitting in aspic back in the 70s or early 80s, but yet something would happen. We'd read something in the New York Times or Huffington Post or wherever, or on a conservative blogger website where the bathroom debate was coming up yet again. It continues to reveal itself. And I think because we think because we've made a lot of so-called technological progress, that we've made societal progress. And I just think we're realizing that we really haven't moved that far. I mean, the people, a big quadrant of society that's really suffering are mothers in the pandemic, because still the division of labor at home is unequal. And so I think that a lot of people have been reflecting on how did we get here, which is, of course, what motivated us, you know, reeling from the results of the 2016 election. And of course, race is an incredible issue in America that must be addressed, but also the misogyny that was just rampant, and it has been rampant over the last 4 years and gone unchecked and undealt with. I think people are wanting to approach story as a place to have a non-polarizing, inclusive discussion about that. And I do think that is something that story can do. I mean, we had such an extraordinary cast, and so we came at the notion of the Equal Rights Amendment from many, many different angles. I think it's got a lot of entry points for a broad audience.
Absolutely. And so you mentioned the importance of these different stories that we're starting to tell and bringing more inclusive projects and voices to the screen. Stacey, as a producer, you can see better than most the direction that Hollywood is headed. What do you want to see more of? And do you feel like there is change happening in that environment? Do you have a mission or a plan in terms of the types of things that you want to attach yourself to going forward?
Absolutely. I mean, look, I'm so happy that we were able to begin to shine a light on Shirley Chisholm and her extraordinary accomplishments. I think we're starting to see it. I was just completely captivated by Nomadland, and to see Chloe Zhao's poetic and beautiful eye trained on American life. It was transformative and transporting. So, you know, I'm a huge fan of Insecure. I love being in Issa Rae's worldview. When you look at like director Bong Joon-ho and Parasite and last year, you know, running the tables in the Oscars, I think what we're getting is the freshness and the renewal of voice in our industry comes from different voices and seeing the world through different eyes. In the same way that when I saw Midnight Cowboy, I didn't know anybody like Ratso Rizzo and Joe Buck. I'm now like totally dating myself, but to give you a super old movie. But I was able to experience the singularity of their humanity and the commonality of our life experiences. And that's what's so exciting about intersectional storytelling. We get to go to different places, and that's what storytelling is about, for me at least.
Absolutely.
But I think too that Hollywood is a bit of a nostalgic concept. And I think that there's so many ways that you can view stories now, that you don't necessarily, because form is content in a lot of ways. Sorry to sound sort of like an advertising slogan, but you know, when you can find different forms and you can make find the right place and size and space, that you can find different audiences, and those audiences will shift the horrible algorithms, you know, that we've been force fed for so many years.
Well, both of you, though, have made notable efforts continually over the decades to, you know, be part of stories that are led by complicated female figures. Cate, you especially have taken on such a variety of different roles of, you know, figures that aren't always super likable, but have a powerful story to tell. So why has that been something you've been drawn to?
I think, I mean, it's sort of it's an act of it's active anthropology for me, you know, the whole process of uncovering stuff, no matter what genre you're in. You know, if you're doing an action film, like you know, then you can the myriad of action films that you can watch, you suddenly learn so much about that genre. And I think the same is often said for women who have lived interesting lives. I think when I was starting out in my career, what used to happen though, is that they were incredibly complicated women in very reductive narratives. And so the process was ultimately incredibly frustrating, hence the notion of the pejorative term biopic, because it is not simply enough to have an interesting life. There are millions of women who have, and I would rather read a book about it. But what happens is that, if you know, when I was first starting out, is you might make a story, a film about an interesting woman, but the narrative would, you know, just be the same story rehashed, or it wouldn't have a chance to be marketed and seen. And so therefore it compounded this idea that stories with women at the center didn't make any money, or no one was interested in seeing them. And I think the wonderful thing, I mean, you know, there's positives and negatives about this so-called streaming revolution, but the positive thing is that there is a myriad of voices out there now, and a myriad of ways of consuming those stories. And so, I mean, to what Stacey was saying about some of her favorite films this year, or screen experiences, the majority of mine are by women. Now, that's not just because I'm looking for them, that's just because they're there. You know, you can see a broader audience gets to see Kelly Reichardt's First Cow, or that incredible Garrett Bradley's documentary Time. You know, look, all of those things that you can see, which speak to experiences outside your own. And so I find that so exciting.
So since we're talking about movies this year and we're in the middle of award season, I want to go there. Stacey, you are involved in the production of the upcoming Oscars. Award shows have been the subject of a lot of conversation lately. You know, do you think that some of the criticisms are appropriate? And how can we as audiences find new meaning or connect in new ways with these shows?
Well, I'm not going to throw rocks at anybody else, since, that's a setup for me at this moment in time. Look, it's very challenging, but I think that, like everything that we're seeing in our society that needs to be shook up a little bit, now's the time to do it, when the rules that apply to everything cannot apply because of the pandemic and for the need for change, for deep change. So I think you return, I'm very romantic about the notion of storytelling and its ability to provide meaning and community in our lives. And I think that that's the thing that we have to lean into. Look, there are a lot of things that are said about Hollywood, right? But we are a union business that figured out how to get our mostly blue collar crews back to work safely with less than a 1% infection rate. And we take care of our own. This year, the Oscars are honoring with the Hirschholt Award, the Motion Picture Television Fund, and those heroic frontline workers in the nursing home at the home in Woodland Hills. So I think, we haven't done a very good job, ironically, telling our own story, because it becomes reduced down to what are you wearing, and as opposed to how do you want people to see, and how do you want to transform people's lives through these incredible empathy machines that are cinemas.
Yeah. And Cate, are you encouraged by changes that have been made in the industry and the types of projects that are cropping up this year or that are on your plate going forward?
Yes, I mean, there's almost too much being made in some respects. It's sort of you have that sense that you can't possibly watch everything, which is exciting on one level. But definitely, I mean, when we were just talking about it earlier, Stacey and I were saying that when we sat down to make a list of directors that we wanted to work with, just out of our mouths poured a whole raft of female directors that we wanted to work with. And, it was scores without even thinking about it. And I don't think that is a conversation that we would have felt confident in taking towards, a streaming platform or then a studio, and knowing that we could get them approved. And it's just a no-brainer. But it's also, unlike Phyllis Schlafly, who was very, very happy being the only woman in the room, I don't think any of us want to be the only woman in the room. And so I think that there's a real sense of, there's a real collegiate spirit. And I'm not just amongst women, amongst men, because I think when you walk onto set and you're the only woman and there's 35 men in front of you, the conversation, the jokes, the outcome will always be the same. And we're a creative industry that thrives on exciting sort of restless churn of ideas, and when those ideas have come from a lot of different perspectives, the outcome will be much more exciting. So I think it's an incredibly exciting time to be emerging into an industry like this, because it's full of possibilities, I think.
Well, on that very uplifting and optimistic note, we'll end this conversation. Cate, Stacey, thank you so much for joining us for the Time Voices of the Future Women's Summit. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cate and Stacey, for joining us today. Next, writer, editor, and activist Raquel Willis is working to ensure that the fight for equality is intersectional and that the coalitions driving it are inclusive.
When you walk through a storm, hold your head up high, and don't be afraid of the dark.
social justice movements and the women's movement isn't inclusive, we lose out on power. We don't fully lean into our power until everyone in the group that we claim to represent is being elevated.
Black women, women of color, queer women, trans women, disabled women, Muslim women, and so many others are still asking many of y'all, ain't I a woman?
Elevating folks on the margins doesn't just transform in a positive way the people who are marginalized, but it also transforms the people who are willingly or not so willingly or intentionally or not so intentionally doing the marginalization. I redesigned the trans flag in 2015 in response to the scores of Black trans women and folks who had been murdered that year. It really was an effort to kind of center Black trans people.
White queer folk get to worry about legislation while Black queer folk is worrying about our lives.
That we get a fuller, more authentic picture of this fight for equality when Black voices are elevated in the LGBTQ plus movement and in women's movements. I also think that you can't really tell the history of the LGBTQ plus community without highlighting in a major way the contributions of Black people. You don't have Stonewall without Black trans folks like Marsha P. Johnson and Zazie Nova.
Darling, I don't have a job, I'm on welfare. I have no intentions of getting a job as long as this country discriminates against homosexuals.
You know, so we've always been here, but such is the case anytime white supremacy is involved, our voices have been kind of snuffed out, and now we're bringing them back to the fore.
Black trans! Black trans! Black trans!
I think we have to start having realer conversations about the patriarchy and conversations about how we still overwhelmingly live in a society where men and masculinity in particular is prioritized. And that's not okay. You know, we have to understand that your experience gender-wise should not be a barrier for you living the life that you deserve and achieving the dreams that you deserve.
I feel guarded.
Judgment.
It's fear of rejection.
I pause when I'm about to encounter someone new. Hello, this is Joe, my roommate.
Airport security, going through customs.
With my coworkers, clients.
I feel like I have to not touch her, like in the grocery store.
It's nonstop.
It changes how I navigate the world sometimes, but I can't change who I am.
It makes me feel resentful. They miss out on me at the end of the day.
That's the worst part.
I would love to have that moment where I don't have to pause.
This is Joe. This is my partner of 37 years. Flight, openness.
Maybe we could just be ourselves.
I could just show up as my true self without having to explain who I am.
Hi, and welcome back to Time's first ever Voices of the Future Women's Summit. Still ahead, we have a special musical performance from Milk. But first, a conversation about the future of leadership, moderated by Vital Voices Global Partnerships CEO Elise Nelson, and featuring emerging leaders Shia Bastida, Tammy Cho, and Chelsea Miller.
Hello, I'm Elise Nelson, President and CEO of Vital Voices Global Partnership, and I'm thrilled to be here and joined by Re-Earth Initiative co-founder Shia Bastida Hate is Not a Virus. Hate is a Virus CEO, Tammy Cho, and Freedom March NYC co-founder, Chelsea Miller. Thank you guys so much for spending your International Women's Day with us. I think we're really at a unique moment where the impact of young and emerging leaders on our national conversations is more visible really than ever before. And even as the COVID-19 pandemic and economic downturn have really disproportionately impacted women, particularly women of color, what is so inspiring to me, and I'm sure to all of you, is just how women are rising up. And they're really leading us forward with creative solutions, really responding directly to the needs of their communities. Chelsea, I think of you and what you've done with Freedom March NYC, and how really, you came to your leadership by same way so many other women do, where you saw a problem in your community and you wanted to step up to right it. Can you talk a little bit about why this moment in particular is feeling different, particularly for the Black Lives Matter movement? Why have young people, particularly young women of color, been so critical for that change?
Yes, absolutely. So when I think about the time that we were in when the death of George Floyd flooded in a lot of ways our phones, right? Because we were at home, we were in a pandemic, and really trying to reckon with the reality, especially for Black folks in this country, that we were in the midst of two pandemics. We had to choose between COVID-19 or racism. We had to make the decision what we were going to step out there for and what we were going to combat. And so what it came down to was really making sure that as the narrative in the media was focused on the looting and the rioting, it was our responsibility, when you talk about history and the civil rights movement and the work of continuing to carry on the legacy and realizing that the civil rights movement never ended. It just has taken on so many different forms. It was our duty and responsibility to get out there and make sure we were doing the work. We were keeping us safe. We were understanding community, the importance of that, and we were changing the narrative. And so it has been an incredible journey to see from the first nights that we went out with gas masks on and there were police choppers in the air, to then throughout the summer being able to see more people feeling comfortable exercising their First Amendment rights and going out to protest, and so many young people on the front lines and Black women leading on the front lines. And so what I will say is that we are in an age where social media and technology has really enabled a lot of the mass sharing of information. But also when we think about the fact that Black women have become more visible in this movement, Black women have always been a part of movements, from Ida B. Wells to Shirley Chisholm to Marsha P. Johnson. You can go on and on. We have carried movements, but the truth is we have a lot of times not received the credit. And so for us, it was really important to make sure that we were centering ourselves, our authenticity, our leadership in the midst of the movement for Black lives.
I think that what I've certainly seen working with women leaders over the last 24 years across every country around the world is that women really do lead differently. And there is something about this moment that I think really calls for that kind of leadership that women bring. And Shea, I think about your leadership. You're such an example of bringing this new approach. Obviously, the climate movement is not new, but I think that young people are bringing a new energy to it. How has this movement made so much progress really with the voices of young people?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question, because I think that the way in which we're organizing is the way in which we want the world to organize itself, if that makes sense. The types of leadership that we are embedding in organizations are the same types of leadership that we want to see in politics, in international NGOs. And that's a type of leadership that is non-hierarchical when it comes to decision-making, a type of leadership that is collaborative, decentralized, and that gives us the power to be global, the power to have hubs around the world. And that has really helped the climate movement flourish. It's not something that is concentrated in one or two countries. It's something that has, really dissipated. And that is because of how our leadership is working. And I'm so excited to tell you that, most of the leadership in the climate movement is young girls. In just my organization alone, 90% of the body is women. And that doesn't mean that we don't need everyone to be part of it. It just means that women are the ones who are taking that step forward, because we have that nature of protecting others, and we want to protect our communities, and we want to protect our children. And we just want that to be for all of humanity, that feeling of protectionism to be part of all of our organizations, part of all of our leaderships. So I think that's why it's worked so well. And also just choosing who your co-leaders are. When you rise up in your city, when you rise up in your country, choosing who you're going to co-lead with is super important, because it's not only about how you lead yourself, but how you make sure that the organization stays healthy and stays proactive.
So Tammy, similarly to both Shea and Chelsea's stories, you saw a horrific problem of violence against the AAPI communities across the United States and beyond. And as the CEO of Hate is a Virus, you are working to dismantle racism and intolerance. What have you seen in the past year to really better mobilize communities to take action against hate? And what are some of your priorities of the organization going forward? I would love to also hear the story of how you founded the organization.
Absolutely. Hate is a Virus is a nonprofit community of mobilizers and amplifiers to dismantle racism and hate. And we actually first got together to launch the movement last year, back in March 2020. And it was in response to the first spike in hate crimes that we were seeing with the AAPI community. And I was able to get together actually through my co-founder, Michelle Hanabusa, who put out a social media post sharing that she felt really frustrated, upset, and heartbroken seeing all the news that was happening around these issues. And, it was right around the time I also felt like I really had to do something about this, especially because these issues hit close to home with, my parents were small business owners, and just seeing the level of racism that we've been experiencing pre-pandemic, and then to see continued attacks on the elderly and the most vulnerable populations didn't sit well with me. And so given the opportunity, reached out to Michelle. We ended up jumping on a phone call and talking about what is the first step that we could take really to help be a part of the solution. And the first immediate step seemed to be to drive local awareness. And, as Chelsea had touched on as well, we have social media, access to social media and these digital platforms. And so the very first step that we took was launching a campaign to really raise awareness of the type of incidents that were occurring. We used the hashtag Hate is a Virus. It started with just a few members of our community, and they ended up spreading it to their friends and their family members. And soon this became a viral movement. And since then, we've also really focused on, as we were hearing more and more from our community in terms of what type of resources they needed, we then decided to take the next step of becoming a nonprofit organization. And so with that, our first, a few of the key program areas that we're focused on is one, continuing to drive local and national awareness of these issues. Second, it's really focused on the educational component, because we recognize that awareness is just the first step. We want to continue to create different resources for our community to better understand not just what is happening among our communities of color, but also why it's happening, including the important historical context as well. And then the final piece is really focused on providing funding for these local and national organizations as well, and finding ways to partner with them to really uplift and amplify the work that they're doing. Because something we also recognize is that, racism is not new. These issues are not new. And there have been people who have been on the grounds doing the work for generations. And as young people, we have opportunity to partner with them and learn from them and continue the work and build upon the work that they have set.
As all of you talk about the movements that you've led, I think what's the thing that connects each of your stories is that it is about power expanding when it's shared. And each of you talk about how you didn't do this alone. You have co-founders, you have partners. Chelsea, I wonder if you could think back to when, a few years back when you were starting your work, what sort of support could you have really used in those early days that you really hope to give the next generation, with that idea that leadership is about, using your power to empower?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's the first time someone has ever asked me that. So I would say that what I think that I needed the most a few years ago, even before Freedom March NYC, was funding and thinking about the sustainable aspect of this work, especially I think for activists, right? There tends to be burnout. There tends to be this idea that you can carry all of this work by yourself in a lot of ways. And I think that over time, I've learned the importance of community, the importance of leaning in, the importance of understanding that though you are an activist and though you exist within the work of social impact, that there are so many other facets of yourself. And you don't have to dim your light for anyone. You don't have to be boxed in for anyone. And so I think that for me, one of the biggest things was understanding kind of like pathways. And so when I mean funding, I don't even necessarily mean in the sense of like organizational support. I think of it through the lens of kind of like big picture. What does it look like to do this work on such a massive scale? What does it look like to equip yourself with the resources that look like funding, that look like amplifying your message, that look like being able to be in the rooms or oftentimes create your own rooms that can ultimately contribute to the longevity of the work that you're doing? Because I see so many times nonprofit organizations that exist for 1 to 2 years and then no longer, right? Because of the fact that this work is so difficult. And in addition to the work being difficult, there's also so many other personal struggles that people go with on a day-to-day basis. And so for me, it's just so important to really make sure that with Freedom March NYC, we are reimagining what those pathways look like. We are investing in the youth. A lot of people say the youth are the future, but aren't giving resources to the youth to lead and show up in that way. And so that's a lot of our work. And I remember when we were first on the front lines, one of the things that we said was that we need amplification, we need funding, and we need to think about how to sustainably do this work because we know what's going to happen with the Black Lives Matter movement and everything that's happening during this summer, because it happened in Ferguson and it happened during Trayvon Martin's case, where it's trending for a few months. The world is paying attention. And then before you know it, there's another issue on a global scale, and people forget and think that now we're back in a post-racial society. And that's false. And so it really is on us that in those moments where the world is asking us, what do we need? We say we need the funding and we need the pipelines to be able to do this work so that when the cameras turn off, we're still here showing up in the way that we need to.
Mm-hmm. And I think that the way you've gone about it has been so powerful because you don't just say, get out and march, raise your voice. You've given young people really concrete steps and actions that they can take to make a difference. And I think that is a huge differentiator for why I think you've been able to mobilize so many young people. I loved the earlier conversation between Alicia Keys and Amanda Gorman. And Amanda, of course, was part of a program that you were part of with Vital Voices, her lead fellowship for young women that really kind of invests in and takes a chance on people who other people haven't taken a chance on. But what I find is that those are the brilliant ideas because those are the ideas that have not been tried, right? And what we know is what we've tried thus far hasn't worked. So we need those new and innovative solutions. And what I loved that Alicia was giving her such great advice about how to be fine with these sort of imperfections, right? And to not feel like just because you're now an icon, you don't have to be perfect. And I think these messages to young women are so deeply important. Shea, I wonder if you could talk more about your work and particularly how you've been really working to make the climate movement accessible to all people. And I think so many of us know that the climate movement, quite frankly, has in the past been dominated by a lot of men. So how has that experience really shaped your perspective on inclusive and intersectional leadership?
Well, I think that's one of the most important topics right now in the climate movement. The fact that the climate movement has been led for the past 60 years by, male white organizations, Greenpeace, Sierra Club, which have been awesome in their particular, scopes, but they haven't really extended to community, the health of communities, the health of people, health of generations, health of ecosystems, health of indigenous communities. What I want to see is a climate movement that is not only recognizing, not climate movement that not only recognizes how the climate crisis affects, immigration, women, how it disproportionately affects some communities more than others, how environmental racism plays in, the generational injustice of the climate crisis. I want a climate movement that recognizes all of this. And once we recognize that, we are able to transfer that to holistic solutions. Because if we cannot see how the climate crisis is intersectional in how it creates the problems, we cannot create holistic solutions that actually are not only about how many parts per million of carbon we are in the atmosphere, but how you are empowering communities to not only deal with the repercussions of the climate crisis, but also how to deal with all of the infrastructure that is polluting their communities. I'm talking about, where does all of our trash go to? It goes to poor Southeast Asian communities in Southeast Asian countries. Where the pipelines go through, it goes through indigenous land all over the US and across the world. So I think that is one of the most important things to take away from how the climate movement is evolving. The fact that it has to be intersectional, it has to be geared towards, everyone, and that's the purpose of making the climate movement inclusive. The fact that we need more voices, more diversity, so that our solutions look diverse, so that our solutions work for everyone, so that the climate movement is not being gatekept by metal straws and, kind of like this elitist way of looking at sustainability and who can afford sustainable things. Because it's not about that. It's about people power. It's about people health and the health of our communities.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And certainly your work is absolutely doing that. And I love the story, Zia, and I wonder if you could just share it of how you started to work on the issue of the climate crisis, because you were personally affected. Your community was personally affected. Can you just tell us that quick story? Because I'm such a big believer that you can only change what you know, and you knew it firsthand. And so you feel it very authentically and lead from that very authentic place.
Yeah, of course. And thank you for, opening the space to share stories, because I think stories are what change perspectives, more than data. Stories empower data in a way. And so, yeah, I grew up in Mexico in a very small town, about 10,000 people, west from Mexico City. And my town historically, I mean like 100 to 100 years ago, was a fishing community. But Mexico City started taking water away from my town to a point where now we don't have the lake that we used to have. And there was a lot of kind of shift from being dependent on water to being dependent on other things. So that was the first thing that happened, that the culture, the tradition of my community was stripped away. Then over the following years, while I was growing up, there was an entrance of factories, transnational companies trying to build a train from my community to Mexico City and connecting others, with complete disregard of our aquifer, our wetlands. And, my dad, he's part of the Otomi Toltec indigenous community, which is in my town and in several others. So I grew up with that notion of reciprocity, of taking care of the earth, because we are part of Mother Earth and not living from it. So living with the earth rather than from the earth. And knowing all of this, I saw how that relationship was being disrespected, how everything was actually being polluted, contaminated, extracted, and that people were profiting off of that pain. And that just makes no sense, growing up from a perspective of loving everything around you. And in 2015, when I was 13 years old, my hometown suffered from flooding. So that's the moment where I realized not only that the climate crisis was already happening, but also that it was affecting communities with the least resources to deal with it the most. And from that perspective, I decided that I couldn't wait to grow up to deal with the climate crisis. I had to give it my all, even as a young woman.
Love that, because you can't wait for an invitation to lead change, and I think that's what is so powerful about young women's leadership today. Tammy, I want to turn to you. We heard earlier in the program from Dolores Huerta, and she was in conversation with one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, Patrisse Cullors, and they were talking about how today, and Chelsea, you alluded to this earlier, how today all of these movements, a lot of these movements for racial justice are actually being led by women. So why do you think it's important that communities of color collectively work to dismantle systemic racism? I mean, I'm thinking particularly about the work that you do with this latest spur of horrific hate crimes and violence against the AAPI community. How do you think young women also are really uniquely positioned to lead this collective movement?
That's such a great question. I think for these movements, you are right, where a lot of them are led by incredible women. I think one thing to also know is that the reality also is that even though these issues, as we mentioned, have been going on for so long, and oftentimes in the past, the faces may have been men, but there were still women that were always there doing the work as well. And I'm so grateful that women are finally getting the recognition and the platform to be able to speak the truth and be able to share and lead these movements as well. Something else that we had found, there had been a study published recently by Harvard Business Review as well, which talked about how women are actually rated more positively, more effective in times of crisis than male leaders are. And across the different 19 core competencies that they evaluated, women rated higher on 13 of those. And those included areas like taking initiative, being able to inspire and motivate others, and also ability to learn and adapt quickly. And I think that is what we're seeing in these moments in this time during the pandemic, with the issues that are going on with all the hate and the racism. We are seeing more women be able to step up and adapt in such a high pressure situation. And I think it's so important, to your question earlier, to continue to find ways to support, uplift, and amplify these women even further. And as Chelsea mentioned as well, get more funding to our young leaders as well. Even in regards to the funding conversation, where many of us are aware of the pay gap, and whether it's with female founders or philanthropic venture funding, all of that is disproportionately low in terms of allocation to women despite this. And so we really need to shift that narrative and shift that dynamic and be able to provide more funding and support to our young leaders.
Well, I want to ask you all one final question, although we could go on all afternoon. But, when Vice President Harris was told that it was not her turn, not her time, I'm sure you've heard something similar or worse, she actually said, "Hey, I eat no for breakfast," which I love. And I wondered if you could, each of you, and we'll start with Chelsea, give us sort of a message to inspire those who may have been told something similar, that, wait for your invitation to lead. The perfect time will come. We all know the perfect time's not going to come. You can't wait for that invitation. So Chelsea, what is that sort of mantra in your head, or those words of encouragement or inspiration that you'd give to those tuning in today and thinking, well, I want to do something to make change in this world?
Absolutely. And so this is something that I actually have lived by for the past couple of years, when I've made decisions that I'm like, there's a risk associated with this, and am I going to fail? But even in that, I still believe in the importance of betting on yourself. And so that's what I always say, bet on yourself. And so when you think about other people's dreams that you spend so much time trying to build, or other people's dreams that you try to fit your path in because this is what's going to make them happy, even in the midst of the doubt, bet on yourself. And you will always surprise yourself, because you learn about your leadership, you learn about your potential, and you learn about what you're capable of.
Tammy, what about you?
I would say change starts with you. I think oftentimes in these moments of crises, we understandably get paralyzed in some moments, or we oftentimes feel like we have to wait for that one leader or that one organization to kind of step up and be the leader of change here, when in reality, each of us can take steps to be a part of the change. That could look like, and it really is different for each person depending on their strength as well, right? So if your strength is being able to produce artwork that really helps illustrate your feelings, that could be one way that you contribute as part of the change. It could also be taking the time to do some of that internal work and internal self-reflection, reading about books about these issues and figuring out how can I check my own biases and be able to be a part of the change. And so really just want to encourage folks to recognize that they have incredible power in their own self and in their own hands, and be able to use that to continue to push these different movements forward.
And Shia, what about you?
I would say to be a stubborn optimist, and that is not always the most popular idea, but truly believe in your power of changing the world. We have agency every single day. If you want to know what the future looks like, look at your actions today. And when you believe in yourself and believe in the future you're building, everything becomes about building joy. Everything becomes about what am I doing today to not only make this work enjoyable and build community, but also make our future enjoyable and build community in the future.
Well, thank you, Shia, Chelsea, and Tammy. I can't imagine a better way, a better last conversation for this Voices of the Future Summit. So thank you to the three of you for your incredible work and for being here today at the Time Women's Summit.
Thank you so much to all of today's speakers for their time and their insights. I hope that you found today's conversations as meaningful as I did. We hope to see you again soon, either on time.com or on Time 100 Talks, our weekly virtual conversation series with the world's most influential people. And now, to play us out, here is musician and social change artist Milk with a powerful performance of her song, Gold.
Hi, I'm Milk, and I'm so honored to be a part of the Time 100 Talks to celebrate the future with female leaders helping to bring in more justice and to advocate for human rights and the issues that are important to the people. I wanted to sing this song called Gold to celebrate this elevated vibration that we're bringing into the world. I hope you enjoy. Come on, look me in the eye. See everything that I survive. See my history is deep. That's what makes me me. And I'll do the same for you. Tell me about what you've been through. When we've been down in the mud, we know better than to judge. Don't mistake my confidence for arrogance. Don't mistake my self-respect for disrespect, 'cause it took me years to turn these tears from water into gold. Yeah, I work for it, I'm proud of it, darling, darling. Sorrow into both, pain is beautiful. Oh, when it makes you grow, it turns these tears to gold. Yeah, yeah, into gold. I lay my hands on the world and I say, tell me where it hurts. Everywhere that I can see, somebody's trying to get free. And if I put myself first, don't mean I kick you to the curb. I wanna shine bright and you can shine bright, and we'll light up the sky. So don't mistake my confidence for arrogance. Don't mistake my self-respect for disrespect. 'Cause it took me years to turn these tears from water into gold. Yeah, I work for it, I'm proud of it, darling, darling. Sorrow into both, pain is beautiful. When it makes you grow, turn these tears to gold. Come on, look me in the eye. See everything that I survived. See my history is deep. That's what makes me me. Don't mistake my confidence for arrogance. Don't mistake my self-respect for disrespect. 'Cause it took me years to turn these tears from water into gold. Yeah, I work for it, I'm proud of it, darling, darling. Sorrow into bold, pain is beautiful. When it makes you grow, turn these tears to gold. Sorrow into bold, pain is beautiful. When it makes you grow, turn these tears to gold. Yeah, yeah. Into gold. Yeah, yeah. Into gold.
Thank you so much for coming to our first annual Time Voices of the Future Women's Summit. And thanks to P&G for making today's event possible.